A few months ago, I decided to get into mining Bitcoin. It seemed like a pretty easy thing to do, and you could buy the miners easily on eBay. When I decided to get into mining Bitcoin, though, I didn't know what I didn't know. I bought an Antminer S9 Plus from eBay from a guy who said it would come with Brains OS Plus to mine Bitcoin. I had no idea what that meant, but it sounded like a good idea. So that purchase fell through. And after quite a few weeks of going back and forth with eBay, I finally got my money back. Well, now I was shopping for an S9 Plus because that's what I'd been shopping for before, and found one from a seller who was in my home state. I felt better about making that purchase. I plugged it in, but it didn't have Brains OS Plus firmware, so I figured out how to get that installed. You'll notice in some of the pictures that instead of figuring out how to disassemble the Antminer, I actually used tin snips and cut open the cover to get to the dip switches. They're really easy to disassemble. Don't be like me. Disassemble it. I did my research, and so I knew that an ASIC miner generated heat. I designed a mining cave to house my miner. It was about 24 cubic feet and cooled with a window air conditioner designed for a 400 square foot room. Figured this was probably going to be good enough. Creativity. I worked it out. I didn't insulate the cave. I wanted it to be leaky so heat could escape. And here's the air conditioner that I put in there. And my creative way to make a 220 volt outlet. So I wrote on it, so there's no way that you could possibly mistake this for a 110 volt outlet, yet I kept trying to plug stuff into it. The heat. I was wrong about how efficient my cooling solution was going to be. It was absolutely mind-boggling how much heat this thing put off. The air conditioner was running constantly, and I was using so much electricity just to try to keep the Antminer cool. Well, I noticed that it had a clear intake and exhaust. And so I figured what I would do is cut a 4-inch square hole and butt the exhaust up against that so that the heat would vent out of the mine so the air conditioner wouldn't be trying to recool the heated air. Now my 900 square foot shop in the winter with 20-degree weather outside was hot. Not warm, uncomfortably hot. And it was loud. I could not believe how loud the fans are on these things. My shop is a detached shop, and when I was sitting in my living room watching TV, I could still hear the fans running in the shop from this miner. That's why people put them in coolers, because of the noise. Well, then one day I'm perusing YouTube, in the YouTube black hole, wasting my time, and I found this video of this guy running an Antminer in an aquarium submerged in mineral oil. Joel Pagan. This blew my mind. I couldn't even imagine submerging your electronics into liquid. But he did it, and it seemed to work. So I got to work doing some research. I found that mineral oil is actually expensive and not that great for your bit miner. I found BitCool BC888 dielectric coolant. It was less expensive than mineral oil, although not inexpensive, and purpose engineered for the task. It seemed like a perfect solution. So I figured I would start with what I know. Joel Pagan was using the CPU cooler and radiator designed for a home PC. He was using a 3-fan model, but I'm cheap, so I went with a 2-fan model. I also did the math from the BC888 datasheet and determined that I needed to flow 63 gallons per hour of fluid to offload the heat. This little pump I found on Amazon claims does 132 gallons per hour, so that was perfect. And BC8088's website also said that if you're using plastic, to be very careful because static electricity would build up. So I was looking for a metal container, and I went with the smallest possible container I could fit my Antminer in because I figured that meant it would use less oil because the oil is expensive. And so I got this little 2-gallon or 2.5-gallon galvanized pail, and the Antminer fit perfectly in it if you have it turned on its side. And here's a picture of it turned on its side. You can see how it absolutely comes right up to the tippy top of the container. Well, the problem was now the hash boards were oriented above each other, and the bottom hash board stayed cool, but the top one overheated and kept going to 0 hash. So I turned it to be 90 degrees like this, and the hash boards were vertical now, like they're designed to be, and the control board and the power controllers, power connectors of the hash boards weren't in the oil, but those aren't the source of the heat. So I figured that was going to be okay. So now the next problem was all 3 hash boards were overheating. Luckily, the tuner was automatically cutting the power. It controlled the heat, but it was only hashing at like 300 hashes per second. I determined the answer was probably going to be increased circulating volume, like a bigger container. So I got tons of these cat litter buckets around my house, and so I just busted out one of these. They're less than 5 gallons. I bought 5 gallons of oil. Figured that was going to be plenty. The result, it worked. If I set the air conditioner to 65 degrees, and I left the door of the cave open, and I left the window of my shop open because it's 20 degrees outside, and I used another fan, it would stabilize the hash at around 11 terahashes per second. It was definitely not efficient though. So I decided to start over. I figured I could build a better mousetrap. So since I figured the CPU radiator was too small, and I thought the rubber fuel line was probably acting as an insulator, I decided that getting a copper coil would be better, because then it would have all that surface area to dissipate the heat, and the copper tubing would let the heat out. So I built my own radiator. And you'll see here that I did the bucket in the side and used some high temp glue sealant for that. That was a bad idea. It leaked and made a mess. This was where I learned to put it into the tub to catch the leaks, because the oil is cheap, but it's not that cheap. So this was what the new situation looked like, with the coil and the fan blowing right down the center, and you can see the fittings going through the sides. The results of this were awful. The coil of copper was not nearly as efficient as that little tiny CPU cooler. But so then I decided I was smarter than that, and so I took a 40-gallon container, storage container, filled it with water, and submerged the coil in that. And then I used a pond pump to circulate that water through the CPU cooler and back in, so it would be cooling the water as the oil was running through the copper, and so it would have better heat transfer to that liquid. So it would be kind of a double liquid cooled situation. That was the absolute worst result I got of anything. Don't do that. Never do that. Water is bad. So the time for a new plan. So far, nothing worked. So I figured if nothing I tried worked, I would just try everything at the same time. So now I was using the copper coil and the CPU radiator and the floor fan and the air conditioner, leaving the window open and leaving the cave open. I didn't do the water. Don't do the water. The water is bad. And so this was the new look. This is what it looked like. And this actually was working. It was doing a decent thing. I mean, it was the kitchen sink approach, but not literally, because kitchen sinks have water and we're not doing water. But it actually worked pretty well. I didn't have to run the air conditioning anymore, and it would still keep it cool enough. It still wasn't efficient though. While it wasn't overheating and it was stable, it was still only doing about 9 terahashes per second instead of 13 or 14. So it was a step in the right direction, and I decided I just needed a better radiator. So I bought a transmission cooler. Now, there were available options for a 4-pass, a 6-pass, and an 8-pass. I went cheap, but not fully cheap because I was getting smarter. I was learning my lesson about going with the least expensive option, so I got the 6-pass transmission cooler. And victory! It worked. It actually worked. It was still cutting the power to about 1100 watts and hashing at about 12 hashes per second, but I was convinced enough to call this proof of concept. So next, I decided to move it to the permanent location. I went ahead and bought a 16-pass transmission cooler and paired it with the 6-pass, although I don't think the 6-pass is really necessary, and moved my miner to a permanent location. The final product, almost the final product. So after I moved the miner, because of either the increased friction or the elevation difference, that little pump that I had been using wouldn't do the trick anymore. So I had to go buy a fuel pump at the local auto parts store. But as Paul Harvey used to say, that's the rest of the story. So now I've got the radiators connected together here using hose clamps to hold them together and connecting them in line with each other using the fuel line. As far as the fan, I just got an old box fan that was in my garage. The legs broke on it, the feet broke on it, so it won't stand up anymore. So I just screwed it in from the top and left it hanging there. Inside the shop, I've got the bucket, and now the original bucket was getting warm and it was bulging out, and I was concerned there was going to be a failure. So when I moved it, I put that bucket inside of another bucket to double the thickness. And so you can see the 2 buckets stacked up here. And from the side option that I used earlier, I learned to always have it in something to catch any oil leaks because the oil is not inexpensive enough to waste. So this is the pump I wound up settling on. It's an Edelbrock diesel generic fuel pump. Seems to work great, and it even came with a 100 micron filter, which I don't know that it's necessary, but I also don't know that I think it hurts anything, so I'm okay with that. The miner, I've got it in the oil. It's submerged. It scares me to death to submerge electronics like this. And you can see here where I was talking about when I cut it, because I didn't know any better. But the one thing I did learn here is you really should clean your miner before you submerge it, because all that black that's on there, that's the dust that was on the heat sinks from when I was air cooling it. And you can't see it, you can see here the copper tubing at the top there. That copper tubing is the return line. It runs down and then does a 90 to be right underneath the center of the miner, so that cooled fluid runs up through the miner. And you can't see it, but there's a black rubber return line here, or the outlet line to the pump, and it's just sitting below the surface. So it's taking the hot oil from the top, pumping it out through the radiators, and returning the cooled oil to the bottom. Final results, not bad. It's not cutting the power, but it's not using all of it. It's hashing at 14.6 terahashes per second, and it actually doesn't reach the target temperature of 99 degrees Celsius. This summer, when it's 100 degrees out, we'll see how it does. Today it's about 45 degrees out, and it can't get up to its full hashing temperature, but it looks pretty efficient. It looks like it's working pretty well to me, so I call this a success. Now, I'm going to put links to all of everything I learned in here. But altogether, my budget for figuring out this my budget cooling project, cost me about $630, not including the Antminer. The cost for the final solution for future cooling projects comes out to about $400, with the bulk of that being the $220 for the oil plus the shipping of the oil. But I think when it's all said and done, the savings on the electricity of not running those fans and of the miner using less electricity, and even if it isn't helpful, the saving the heat and the noise, I think it's all going to work out okay. Now this summer, if I find that this solution doesn't work anymore, I'll update the video. But for now, I'm pretty darn happy with the discoveries that I've made and the results. So save yourself some time, save yourself a couple $100. If you want to do immersion cooling on the cheap, I think this is about as cheap as you're going to be able to get it. And look in the description for the links, and feel free to make a donation to my crypto wallet if you found this information helpful. Thank you.